For 25 years, Garrick was the heartbeat of our home. A woman who moved like a shadow, spoke only in yes, sir, or no, ma'am, and polished the silver until it mirrored our own oblivious faces. But as I stood over my father's casket, she did something she had never done. She touched my arm, looked me in the eye with a gaze that felt like a mirror, and whispered 5 words that turned my entire lineage into a lie. Julian, 32, the sole heir to a massive real estate empire, has lived a life of cold privilege. His father, Alistair, was a man of iron rules and deep secrets. Mrs. Garrick, the housekeeper, was hired the month Julian was born and has remained a constant, silent fixture. The setting is the family's ancestral manor during the week of the funeral. The emotional tone is one of crumbling stability, and the sudden, violent intrusion of a long-suppressed truth. The silence of Blackwood Manor wasn't the peaceful kind. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that settled into the floorboards the moment the last mourner left. My father, Alistair, was finally in the ground, and the house felt less like a home and more like a hollowed-out ribcage. I sat in his study, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth and the amber glow of a third glass of neat scotch. The door creaked, not the tentative knock of a servant, but a deliberate heavy push. Mrs. Garrick, the woman who had been the silent, gray ghost of my childhood for 30 years, stepped into the room. I expected her to move toward the decanter, to perform the invisible labor she had mastered for decades. Instead, she did the unthinkable. She walked past the tray, reached out a hand to the high-backed leather chair that still smelled of my father's tobacco, and sat down. The shift. Her posture, usually a rigid curve of subservience, straightened. The voice. "The ice is melting, Julian," she said. Her voice was rich and melodic, a shock to my system, considering I hadn't heard her utter more than 3 consecutive words since 1994. "You're speaking," I stammered, the glass trembling in my hand. "I am a woman of my word, Julian. And my word was bought and paid for by your father's legal team." She leaned back into the leather. "A 30-year non-disclosure agreement, drafted in the wake of a scandal you were too young to remember. It expired at 4:12 p.m. today, the moment Alistair's heart stopped beating. The legal vow. For 3 decades, Mrs. Garrick hadn't just been a housekeeper. She had been a living contract. Her silence was the only thing keeping the Blackwood name from the tabloids. She reached into the pocket of her starched white apron and pulled out a tarnished silver locket. She didn't hand it to me. She held it open under the lamp. The image. Inside was a grainy black and white photograph. A young Alistair, smiling with a warmth I never knew he possessed, was draped over the shoulder of a woman in a floral dress. The twin. The woman in the photo didn't just resemble Mrs. Garrick. She was Mrs. Garrick, or a version of her before the gray took over. The same high cheekbones, the same defiant tilt of the chin. "Who is she?" I whispered, though the answer was already chilling my blood. "She was the woman Alistair Blackwood loved," she replied, her gaze fixed on the photo. "And I am the woman he spent 30 years trying to erase. He didn't hire me to clean his floors, Julian. He hired me so he could keep his greatest mistake under his thumb, where he could watch it wither." She snapped the locket shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The funeral is over. Now let's talk about what's actually buried in the cellar." The name Eleanor felt heavy in the air. A ghost finally given a shape. I looked at the woman sitting in my father's chair, the woman who had bandaged my knees, prepared my favorite meals, and moved like a shadow through my life, and I saw the features I had inherited. The same slate-gray eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. "I wasn't the help, Julian," she said, her voice steady but laced with a lifetime of repressed grief. "I was the heir. Before you were even a thought, before this house was filled with your mother's fine china, there was a small cottage on the edge of the estate. And there was a marriage certificate that nearly brought the Blackwood empire to its knees." Eleanor explained the hierarchy of the Blackwood bloodline. My grandfather, a man of iron and ice, had given Alistair an ultimatum: annul the marriage to the laborer's daughter and dispose of the child, or lose every penny of the inheritance. The transaction. Alistair didn't choose love. He chose the manor. The erasure. He paid for a quiet annulment and a new identity for his wife. But for Eleanor, his firstborn, he devised a more twisted punishment. He brought her back into the house under the name Mrs. Garrick when she was barely 20. The keeper of the secret. He couldn't stand the thought of me being out in the world, a living piece of evidence, she whispered. So he hid me in plain sight. He made me a ghost in my own birthright. As she spoke, I began to see the house differently. The Garrick quarters weren't just a servant's wing. They were a high-security containment zone. The hidden protector. I remembered the time I fell from the oak tree. My father hadn't even looked up from his ledger, but Mrs. Garrick had been there before I even hit the ground. The silent education. She hadn't just cleaned my room. She had curated my library. She had steered me toward the law, toward justice, toward the very tools I would need to dismantle Alistair's legacy. He kept you in a starched apron to keep his seat at the table, I said, the realization tasting like ash. Every time you poured his tea, you were a reminder of the man he was too cowardly to be. He thought he was controlling me, Julian, Eleanor said, standing up and smoothing her apron. But a housekeeper sees everything. I know where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. And I didn't stay for him. I stayed for you. You were the only part of this family that wasn't rotten. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled a specific, unmarked ledger from a hidden compartment my father had shown me only once. She threw it onto the desk. Your father's will leaves everything to you, she said. But there is a secondary trust. One he thought I'd never find. It's for the firstborn of Blackwood. He never changed the wording, likely out of some lingering superstitious guilt. According to the law he made you study, Julian. This house doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. The fire in the hearth flared, casting a long shadow of the servant across the mahogany walls. The morning light hit the study, but the atmosphere remained heavy with the revelations of the night. I couldn't stop thinking about a strange rhythmic humming that had soundtracked my childhood. A nonsensical rhyme Eleanor used to murmur while she polished the silver or tucked me into bed. It went, 6 for the manor, 12 for the stone, 3 for the daughter, and 0 for the bone. I repeated it aloud. Eleanor, standing by the window, went still. I didn't think you were listening back then, Julian. That wasn't just a song. It was the only thing I had to keep my identity from dissolving into the dishwater. The numbers 6, 12, 30 weren't just a rhyme. They were the combination to a private safe deposit box at the First National Bank of the Highlands. Eleanor hadn't been able to access it while the non-disclosure agreement was active, but as Alistair's legal servant with power of attorney over his minor errands, she had been the one to deposit the items 30 years ago. The arrival. We stood in the sterile, chilled air of the bank vault. The clerk handed us a long gray metal box. The opening. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was the documented proof of the Blackwood shadow life. Eleanor's hands trembled as she pulled out the parchment. These weren't copies, they were the originals. The marriage certificate. Dated May 14, 1972. Alistair Blackwood and Mary Vance. A legal binding union that preceded my mother's marriage by nearly a decade. The birth certificate. A record for Eleanor Blackwood, born to the union above. No mention of Garrick. Tucked behind the certificates was a heavy, cream-colored envelope addressed simply to E. The handwriting was my father's, not the sharp, aggressive scrawl of his business ledgers, but a shaky, fluid script I'd never seen. The letter. I am a man who bought a kingdom with the currency of my soul. I could not let you go, Eleanor, because you are the only part of me that was ever truly alive. I kept you in the house not out of cruelty, but because I am a coward who needed a reminder of the man I failed to be. I hope, in the end, you find the strength to burn the house I spent my life building. The twisted logic. Alistair hadn't kept her close to torment her. He had kept her as a moral compass he was too weak to follow. The revelation. He had lived every day of my life looking at the daughter he had erased, using her presence as a secret penance for his greed. I looked at the letter, then at the sister I had only just found. The shame my father had hidden wasn't a crime of violence, but a crime of silence. He had traded a living daughter for a stone manor, and then spent 30 years watching her clean the very floors she should have inherited. He apologized, I said, handing her the letter. Apologies are for people who intend to change, Julian, Eleanor replied, her voice cold as she folded the birth certificate. He just wanted to sleep better at night. But the certificates? These are for me. These mean the Blackwood name is finally mine to destroy. She looked at me, a flicker of softness in her gray eyes. Are you going to stand with me, Julian? Or are you going to protect the legacy of the man who lied to us both? The bank box had provided the legal truth, but the moral decay of Blackwood Manor ran even deeper. I had always remembered my mother, Beatrice, as a fragile, ethereal socialite who floated through the corridors like a cloud of Chanel No. 5. She died when I was 12, a tragedy that supposedly broke my father. But as I sat in the attic sorting through her private vanity desk, a piece of furniture Eleanor insisted I open, I found the ledger of her own secret life. Tucked behind a false panel in a jewelry box were the stubs of a decade's worth of personal checks. All were made out to Eleanor Garrick. All were for significant round numbers. And all bore the same chilling memo line. Service rendered/silence retained. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching me realize that the bonuses my mother had supposedly given her for loyal service were actually installments of a lifelong ransom. The agreement. Beatrice hadn't been a victim of Alistair's secret. She was an active shareholder in it. When she married my father, she knew about the laborer's daughter. She knew Eleanor was the rightful firstborn. The price of the son. Beatrice had paid Eleanor for the privilege of playing the role of the lady of the manor. More importantly, she had paid for the right to claim me as the sole heir. The bitter truth. She didn't hate me, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice devoid of its usual sharpness, replaced by a weary hollow. She was terrified of me. Every time she looked at me, she saw the ghost of the woman Alistair actually loved. She paid me to stay in the shadows so the world would believe you were the beginning of the Blackwood line, not the second act. The nursery trade. I realized why Eleanor was always the one to comfort me. Beatrice couldn't bear the guilt of being near me, the living proof of the legacy she had stolen. She outsourced the mothering to the woman she was actively disenfranchising. The double betrayal. My father had erased a daughter for a manor. My mother had bought a son with a housekeeper's dignity. I looked at the last check stub, dated just a week before my mother's fatal car accident. It was for the largest amount yet. On the back, in Beatrice's elegant script, were the words, "He's starting to look like you, Eleanor." The gray in his eyes. God forgive us both. She knew, I whispered, the paper crinkling in my grip. She lived in this house for 15 years playing a part she knew was a fraud. We all played our parts, Julian, Eleanor said, walking over and taking the check stub from me. She played the lady, I played the ghost, and Alistair played the king. But the play is over now. She looked toward the door. Below, the crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of the Vance Blackwood legal team. My mother's family, coming to ensure their legitimate nephew inherited the estate. They didn't know that the staff they were about to dismiss was actually the owner of the ground they were standing on. The legal team was at the front gate. Their arrival a cacophony of luxury engines and self-importance. But Eleanor didn't lead me to the foyer to greet them. Instead, she pulled a small, unassuming iron ring near the pantry's dry goods shelf. A section of the wall, one I had walked past 10,000 times, shuddered and slid back on greased internal tracks. You always wondered why your father's business acumen was so inconsistent, Eleanor said, stepping into the dark aperture. How a man who couldn't remember his own wedding anniversary could predict a market collapse 3 months in advance. I followed her into a space that defied the manor's blueprints. This wasn't a servant's crawl space, it was a parallel suite. The sanctuary. It was a mirror of the study upstairs, but warmer, filled with the scent of jasmine tea instead of stale tobacco. There was a desk, a lamp, and a window that looked out through a cleverly disguised stone lattice. The vantage point. From here, the pantry, the dining room, and the foyer were all visible and audible. The silent partner. For 30 years, Eleanor hadn't just been the help. She had lived within the very walls of the estate, a silent shadow who watched the mechanics of the family and the business from the inside out. The walls were lined with the same leather-bound volumes found in Alistair's study, the ones he claimed to have mastered. I pulled one from the shelf. Global Trade and the Blackwood Legacy. The True Genius. The margins were a battlefield of ink. In Eleanor's precise, elegant hand, she had corrected my father's flawed logic, drafted the scripts for his most famous speeches, and mapped out the acquisition of the textile mills that saved us in '08. The puppeteer. My father had been the face of the Blackwood Empire, but Eleanor had been the brain. He would bring his problems to the pantry, and by morning, the solutions would be waiting on a silver tray with his tea. "He didn't keep me here just because of the scandal," Eleanor whispered, running her hand over the desk. "He kept me because he was a hollow man. He knew that without my mind, he was just a suit filled with inherited dust. He bought my silence, but he used my brilliance to pay for it. I realized then that the bonuses my mother had paid weren't just for silence. They were the salary for the woman who was keeping their entire world from collapsing." Suddenly, the muffled sound of voices drifted through the vents. The legitimate relatives had entered the foyer above. I heard my Uncle Marcus's booming, arrogant voice. "We'll need to clear out the staff immediately. Start with that Garrick woman. She knows too much." Eleanor looked up at the ceiling, a cold, predatory smile touching her lips. She reached into her desk and pulled out a digital tablet, synced to every secure server in the Blackwood network. "They want to talk about clearing out the assets," Eleanor said, her fingers flying over the screen. "Perhaps it's time to show them who actually owns the keys to the kingdom." The grand drawing room felt like a courtroom, the air thick with the smell of old dust and expensive perfume. My Uncle Marcus and the rest of the Beatrice Blackwood clan sat in a row of Louis XIV chairs, their faces set in expressions of practiced grief. At the head of the table sat Mr. Sterling, the family's lawyer for 40 years. A man whose face was a map of every secret the Blackwoods had ever paid to bury. He cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles as he opened the heavy vellum folder. "The primary estate goes to Julian, of course," he began, his voice a dry rasp. "However, there is a contingency clause regarding 30% of the liquid assets and the secondary holdings in the North Sea." The room went silent. I felt Eleanor standing behind me, her hands clasped in the familiar housekeeper pose, but her eyes were fixed on Sterling with a terrifying intensity. The clause. The will stipulated that this portion was reserved for the heir of the First Union. The claim. Sterling looked up, his expression one of feigned regret. Since Alistair's only marriage was to Beatrice, and since no records of any prior union exist in the public archives, this portion is technically unclaimed. Under a private agreement Alistair signed years ago, in the event of no valid claimant, these assets are to be transferred to the Sterling Trust for administrative liquidation. I saw the game immediately. Sterling hadn't just been Alistair's lawyer. He had been his cleaner. He knew about the 1972 marriage. He knew about Eleanor. But he had spent 30 years erasing the paper trail, and now he was moving in to harvest the crop he had helped plant. The betrayal. Sterling was betting on the fact that Mrs. Garrick was a ghost with no paper identity. If she couldn't prove she was the daughter, the unclaimed millions would fall right into his lap as a reward for his long service. "Is there a problem, Julian?" Uncle Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing. "Surely you aren't going to contest the administrative fees for Mr. Sterling? He's kept our family name clean for decades." I looked back at Eleanor. She gave me a single imperceptible nod. "The union wasn't a myth, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the room's tension like a blade. "And the heir isn't unclaimed. She's been serving you tea for the last hour." The shock. Sterling's face went from pale to a sickly gray. He looked at Eleanor, not as a servant, but as the woman who had lived inside the walls while he whispered his schemes to my father. "The proof." Eleanor stepped forward, no longer a ghost. She placed the original 1972 marriage certificate and her birth certificate, the ones from the nursery rhyme box, directly on top of the will. "Alistair Blackwood didn't have one heir, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor said, her voice rich and authoritative, silencing every relative in the room. "He had two. And I've spent the last 30 years auditing your administrative fees from the hidden wing of this house. I know exactly how much you've been skimming from the North Sea accounts." Sterling's hand trembled. He reached for the certificates, but I pinned them to the table. "The Sterling Trust is finished," I said. "And as for the administrative liquidation, I believe my sister has a much more permanent plan for those assets." Outside, the first autumn storm broke, thunder rattling the windows of Blackwood Manor. The servant was gone. The rival heir had arrived to take her seat at the table. The drawing room cleared like a crime scene, leaving only the firstborn, the heir, and the cleaner. Sterling didn't panic. He smoothed his silk tie, his eyes darting to the certificates on the table. "You've played a brilliant hand, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice dripping with forced admiration. "But a piece of paper doesn't change the fact that you are a penniless ghost. I'm prepared to offer you $5 million to vanish. A new name, a villa in Spain, justice in exchange for silence." Eleanor didn't even blink. "I've spent 30 years in the shadows, Sterling. I didn't stay for the money. I stayed for the name." When the bribe failed, Sterling's face contorted into something jagged and predatory. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. "You think you're taking this house? You're walking into a prison cell. I know how Alistair really died. His heart didn't just stop. It was helped along. The accusation." Sterling pulled a folder from his briefcase, copies of Alistair's medical records from the final month. "The framed narrative. You were the one who prepared his evening tea, Eleanor. You were the only one with access to his bedside pill organizer. I have the tox reports ready to be sent to the DA. A long-suffering servant taking revenge on her cruel master. The jury will love it." Sterling laid out a chart showing the interaction between Alistair's heart medication and a specific, undetectable sedative. The trap. Sterling wasn't just guessing. He had been the one to suggest the specialist who prescribed the new medication. He had been building this kill switch for months, waiting for the moment he needed to neutralize Eleanor or Julian. The medlog. Sterling produced a log showing Mrs. Garrick's signature on every delivery of the sedatives. The motive. "You found out he was never going to acknowledge you publicly, didn't you? So you decided to speed up the inheritance. That's the story I'll tell the police." I felt the blood drain from my face, but Eleanor remained unervingly still. She looked at the medical log Sterling was brandishing, the one with her forged signature. "You always were a sloppy forger, Sterling," she said, her voice echoing with the authority of the hidden wing. "You assumed I was just a housekeeper. You forgot that I was the one who installed the silent archive in my father's bedroom 3 years ago to monitor his sleep apnea." Eleanor pulled her digital tablet from her apron. She didn't show a ledger this time. She played a video file. On the screen the grain was low light but clear. It showed my father's bedroom 2 nights before his death. Eleanor wasn't in the room. Sterling was. The camera captured him clearly leaning over the nightstand, replacing the capsules in the bedside organizer with a steady clinical hand. "I didn't tamper with his tea, Sterling," Eleanor said, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in her eyes. "But I watched you tamper with his life. I let you do it because I knew you'd eventually try to use it against me. You didn't just kill my father. You recorded your own execution." Outside, the storm intensified. Sterling looked at the screen, then at the heavy mahogany door. The poisoned ink wasn't on the certificates. It was in the footage he never knew existed. The video of Sterling in the bedroom hung in the air like a thermal flare. But a dark thought took root in my mind. If Eleanor had seen him tampering with the pills, why hadn't she stopped him? I looked at her, the woman who had spent a lifetime in the hidden wing, watching the slow rot of our family. "You let it happen," I whispered, my voice thick with a sudden sharp betrayal. "You watched him replace those pills and you did nothing." "I did everything, Julian," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "But I didn't do it at the bedside. I did it in the kitchen." Eleanor led me back to the service pantry, where the heavy silver tea service sat polished to a mirror shine. She picked up the ornate Georgian teapot, the one Alistair insisted on using every night at 9 p.m., the secret filter. She unscrewed the decorative finial on the lid. Inside was a custom-fitted, double-mesh lining made of surgical-grade charcoal and a chemical neutralizer. The ritual. "Sterling started sending those herbal supplements from the Swiss clinic 5 years ago," Eleanor explained. "He told Alistair they were for longevity. I knew they were a slow-acting toxin designed to weaken his arterial walls. Every night for 1,800 nights, Eleanor had performed a silent act of chemical warfare to save the man who had erased her. The sacrifice. I wasn't just making tea. I was distilling his life. I used the equipment in my hidden suite to analyze every shipment Sterling sent. I spent my own bonuses from your mother to buy the reagents needed to neutralize the poison in his cup. The evidence." She opened a small tin labeled Darjeeling. Inside weren't tea leaves, but hundreds of neutralized crystals she had filtered out. Physical proof of a 5-year attempted murder. The failure. The pills Sterling switched at the end. That was a concentrated dose. A direct strike. I couldn't filter what he took in secret while I was asleep. I kept Alistair alive for 5 years longer than Sterling intended. I didn't let him die. I ran out of ways to save him. I looked at the silver set. For my entire life I had seen a housekeeper serving a master. Now I saw a chemist protecting a patient who didn't even know he was being hunted. Eleanor hadn't been waiting for him to die. She had been his only shield against the man he trusted most. "You loved him," I said, the realization hitting me harder than the truth of the birth certificate. "After everything he did to you, you still saved him." "He was my father, Julian," she said, her voice finally breaking. "And he was yours. I wouldn't let a snake like Sterling take the life that belonged to us." A heavy crash sounded from the study. We ran back to find Sterling had overturned the desk, desperately searching for the tablet or the master drive. He looked up, his hair disheveled, the mask of the sophisticated lawyer completely shattered. "It doesn't matter what you filtered," Sterling screamed. "The tox report will still show the final dose. I'll burn this house down with both of you in it before I let a maid and a brat take my retirement." He lunged for the heavy silver letter opener on the desk, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply picked up the tea tray. "The tea is cold, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "And so is the trail. I sent the video and the neutralized samples to the chief of police 10 minutes ago. They aren't coming for an inheritance. They're coming for a murderer." The police sirens were still miles away, muffled by the thick stone walls and the roar of the storm. Sterling stood in the center of the study, the silver letter opener gripped in his white-knuckled hand. I looked at the firstborn deed, then at the man who had been my father's shadow, and finally at Eleanor. I had to choose. I could claim the sole inheritance by letting Sterling's frame-up of Eleanor proceed, or I could burn the legitimate legacy to the ground. I caught Eleanor's eye. She saw the calculation in my gaze. I gave a slight, sharp nod. The Blackwood Theatre was about to begin its final act. "You're right, Sterling," I said, my voice suddenly cold, echoing the hollow arrogance of my father. I stepped away from Eleanor, moving toward the mahogany desk. A housekeeper with a grudge. It's a much cleaner story for the press than a hidden sister and a 30-year fraud. The reaction. Eleanor gasped, her face a mask of shock. "Julian? You know what he did. You saw the tea filters. The cast out. I saw a woman who overstepped," I spat, pointing at the door. "Get out, Eleanor. Take your certificates and your tea sets and vanish. I won't have you dragging my father's name through the mud just to claim a seat that isn't yours." Sterling's shoulders dropped. The predatory tension left his frame, replaced by a smug, oily triumph. He dropped the letter opener onto the desk with a heavy clatter. "Smart boy," Sterling chuckled, smoothing his lapels. "Alistair always said you had the Blackwood instinct for self-preservation. Why share a kingdom with a servant when you can have it all? I can make that video disappear, Julian. We can say the toxins were a tragic self-administration by a depressed old man." The trap. Sterling leaned over the desk, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "We've been partners for years, boy, even if you didn't know it. I've been skimming the North Sea accounts since '02 to build a cushion for us. I took 20 million over 20 years. Alistair was too busy listening to his ghost to notice the decimal points moving. The admission. "And the pills, Sterling?" I prompted, leaning in. "You really had to kill him? We couldn't just keep the supplement routine going." The boast. "The old fool was starting to suspect the North Sea drain," Sterling sneered. "He was going to audit the Sterling Trust. I had to end him before he realized his loyal lawyer had hollowed out his empire. It was a masterpiece, Julian. The perfect crime. Until this woman crawled out of the walls." I straightened up, the Blackwood instinct vanishing from my face. I reached over to the side table and picked up my phone, turning the screen toward him. Recording saved. Uploaded to cloud storage. Eleanor stopped her sobbing and stood tall, her expression as hard as flint. "You were always better at math than theater, Sterling," she said. "You just confessed to embezzlement? fraud and first-degree murder on a direct line to the district attorney's office. Julian didn't cast me out, he just gave you enough rope to hang yourself. The front doors of the manor burst open. This time it wasn't the wind. The hall was flooded with blue and red light as the police swarmed the foyer. Sterling turned to run toward the hidden wing, but Eleanor stood in his way, the heavy iron ring of keys held like a weapon. "That door is for family only," she whispered. "And you've just been evicted." The morning after Sterling's arrest, Blackwood Manor was no longer a tomb of secrets. It was a hive of activity. For the first time in 30 years, the heavy velvet drapes in the grand foyer were pulled wide, letting the pale winter sun expose every speck of dust and every lie the house had held. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the black sedans of the Blackwood Global Board of Directors pull up the drive. They were coming to salvage the brand, but I was there to dismantle the dynasty. The meeting took place in the formal dining room, the very table where Eleanor had served tea as a ghost for decades. I laid the nursery rhyme documents and the digital archive of the hidden wing in the center of the table. The declaration. Alistair Blackwood's success wasn't his own, I told the stunned executives. The strategic pivots and the North Sea recovery were the work of a mind you've ignored for 30 years. The recognition. I handed the board the newly filed amended heirship affidavit. I am legally acknowledging Eleanor Blackwood as the firstborn daughter of Alistair and Mary Blackwood. She is the majority stakeholder of this estate. And effective immediately, she is the chairwoman of the board. The board members looked at each other in terrified silence. Then the service door, the narrow, hidden entrance Eleanor had used for a lifetime, remained shut. Instead, the massive oak front doors swung open. Eleanor walked in. She wasn't wearing the starched white apron or the gray uniform. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal wool. Her silver hair styled with the same precision she had once applied to the family ledgers. The shift. She didn't walk to the sideboard to check the coffee. She walked to the head of the table. She didn't wait for them to stand. She sat in the master's chair and looked at the men who had spent years talking over her as if she were furniture. The city's headlines were a firestorm. The silent heir, one read. Blackwood housekeeper revealed as lost daughter. The public reckoning. I stood beside her as we faced the press on the manor steps. I didn't speak as the heir. I spoke as the younger brother. The new legacy. We didn't try to hide the scandal. We leaned into it. We exposed the poisoned ink and the care Eleanor had taken to save our father. The public didn't see a maid seeking a payout. They saw a daughter who had survived a 30-year exile. As the last of the board members scurried away, Eleanor and I stood in the quiet foyer. She looked up at the portrait of Alistair that hung over the mantel. He's gone, Eleanor, I said. The debt is paid. The keys are yours. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy iron ring of keys. She walked over to the portrait and unhooked it from the wall, setting it on the floor with its face turned toward the dark wood. I don't need the keys to a cage, Julian, she said softly. She walked to the front door, propped it open with a heavy marble bust of our grandfather, and breathed in the cold, honest air of the world outside. For the first time in my life, I'm going to walk through this door just because I can. The silence of Blackwood Manor had been replaced by a different kind of quiet. The comfortable, resonant stillness of a house that no longer has anything to hide. The heavy mahogany dining table, once a site of cold, formal meals under Alistair's shadow, was now bathed in the warm light of a late afternoon sun. There were no servants today. The staff had been given the week off, a gesture of the new management. I sat at the far end, and for the first time in my life, Eleanor sat at the other. Not standing by the sideboard, not waiting with a tray, but seated in the high-back chair that had once belonged to our mother, Beatrice. On the table sat the Georgian tea service. Eleanor had polished it that morning, a habit of the hand she couldn't quite break. I looked down at the curved surface of the teapot and saw my own reflection. The vision, my face, distorted by the silver, merged with the reflection of Eleanor sitting across from me. The realization. I saw the slant of the brow, the specific curve of the jaw, the family markers that had been hidden in plain sight for 30 years. I hadn't just been looking at a housekeeper all those years. I had been looking at my own mirror image, aged by a sacrifice I was only beginning to comprehend. The true head of house. I realized then that while Alistair had worn the suits and Sterling had moved the money, Eleanor had been the one who maintained the physical and moral foundation of the Blackwood name. She was the one who knew the architecture, the chemistry, and the history. The redistribution. We had already begun the process of converting the hidden wing into a public archive for the laborers' history of the valley, the people Eleanor's mother had come from. The shared burden. I don't want to run this alone, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice soft but certain. I've spent too long watching. I want to build something that doesn't require a hidden architect. Eleanor reached out and picked up the teapot. She didn't pour for me. She poured for herself first, then pushed the pot toward me across the table. It was a simple movement, but it shattered a century of the Blackwood way. The silver is finally clean, isn't it? She asked, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. It's more than clean, Eleanor, I replied, pouring my own tea. It's clear. Outside, the heavy iron gates of the estate were being replaced. The Blackwood name was staying, but the bars were gone. As we sat together, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house didn't feel like a cage or a tomb. It felt like a beginning. The silent housekeeper was gone. In her place sat the woman who had saved my life and restored my soul. We were no longer master and servant, heir and ghost. We were just siblings finally home. Did you enjoy the story? And from which city are you listening? Tell me in the comments. I always love hearing from you. If this story touched your heart, you can support me with a super thanks. Your support helps me continue creating more stories for you. 2 more beautiful life stories are on your screen right now. I hope you enjoy them too. There's so much more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.